The forest felt alive the moment I stepped into it. The cool breeze rustled the towering pines, their needles brushing together in whispers. I had come alone, not for the thrill, but for the quiet. After weeks of city noise, deadlines, and the constant hum of technology, I needed this. I parked my car a mile down the gravel road, loaded my pack, and started the hike to the campsite I had picked out online. It promised solitude, clear skies, and a stream nearby for water. The first hour was peaceful. The trail, barely visible in some places, twisted through thick underbrush and patches of ferns. Occasionally, I'd hear a bird call or the distant crunch of leaves. Likely a deer. The deeper I went, the more the modern world faded away. My phone had lost signal 30 minutes ago, but I didn't care. That was the point. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing. It was everything I'd hoped for. A flat patch of ground surrounded by trees, with the faint sound of running water nearby. I set up my tent first, careful to secure the stakes in case the wind picked up. Then I unpacked my small camping stove and a can of chili for dinner. I'd packed light, just the essentials, and my bag already felt much easier to carry without the tent and gear inside. As the sun dipped lower, I decided to explore the stream. It wasn't far, maybe 50 yards from the clearing, and it was just as I'd imagined. Clear water flowing over smooth stones, shallow enough to wade through if I needed to. I filled my bottle and treated the water with a purification tablet. Tasted slightly off, but it was clean. Back at camp, I lit a small fire. The air grew colder as dusk settled in, and the fire's warmth was a welcome comfort. I ate my chili, staring into the flames and listening to the forest. At first, it was soothing, the kind of silence you don't realize you miss until it's gone. But as night fell, the silence began to feel heavy. The occasional crack of a branch or rustle of leaves seemed louder. Closer, I'd read about this, how being alone in the wilderness can heighten your senses, make you hyper-aware of every sound. It's instinct, they say, left over from when we had to watch for predators. But knowing that didn't make it less unsettling. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons, creatures as uninterested in me as I was in them. Still, I kept my headlamp and knife close as I crawled into my tent. The first few hours of sleep came easily. The exhaustion from the hike and fresh air knocked me out. But sometime in the night, I woke up. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint orange light through the tent fabric. I wasn't sure what had woken me at first. Then I heard it. A faint, deliberate crunch of leaves. Not the random scuttle of an animal, but something heavier, steady. My pulse quickened. I lay still, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. Footsteps. Human footsteps. My first thought was that it must be another camper, maybe someone lost or looking for a spot to set up. But what were the chances of someone stumbling upon my secluded clearing? I'd picked this spot precisely because it was off the beaten path. The footsteps stopped. I strained to hear, but the forest had gone silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves, just my own breathing and the pounding of my heart. I reached for my headlamp and clicked it on. The beam of light cut through the tent, casting long shadows outside. I unzipped the tent slowly, trying not to make a sound, and peered out. Nothing, just trees and darkness. The embers of the fire glowed faintly, but they didn't offer much light. I scanned the area, my headlamp sweeping over the clearing. Still nothing. I told myself it must have been my imagination, or maybe an animal after all. But the unease lingered as I zipped the tent back up and lay down again. I didn't sleep much after that. Every sound, every creak, every rustle felt amplified. I kept checking the time on my watch, willing the hours to pass faster. Finally, dawn broke, and with it came a sense of relief. The sunlight made everything feel safer, less threatening. I decided to stay another night despite the uneasy feeling. I'd driven hours to get here, and I didn't want to cut my trip short over what was probably nothing. During the day, I hiked to a nearby ridge and took in the view, trying to shake off the night before. By the time I returned to camp, I felt better, more grounded. I rebuilt the fire and cooked another simple meal. As night fell again, the forest seemed to close in around me. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I'd feel better once I was asleep. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time, the sound wasn't footsteps. It was breathing, slow, measured breaths just outside the tent. My blood turned to ice. I stayed as still as possible, barely daring to breathe myself. The sound moved, a faint shuffling, like someone circling the tent. Then it stopped. The silence was suffocating. I fumbled for my knife, my hands shaking. My headlamp was within reach, but I hesitated to turn it on. What if I saw something I didn't want to see? The breathing started again, louder this time, closer. I couldn't take it anymore. I clicked on the headlamp and unzipped the tent in one motion, shining the light outside. Nothing, just empty forest. The fire had gone out completely, and the clearing was bathed in shadows. My chest heaved as I scanned the area, knife in one hand, headlamp in the other. The breathing was gone. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the cold fire pit, clutching the knife and jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I packed up as quickly as I could. I didn't care about breakfast or even coffee. I just wanted to leave. The hike back to my car felt longer than it should have. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves made me spin around, expecting to see someone or something following me. But there was never anything there. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear into the trunk and locked the doors the moment I got inside. As I drove away, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. But the forest remained still, fading into the distance. I don't know what happened that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was an animal that sounded too much like a person. Or maybe someone was out there watching me. I'll never know for sure. But one thing's certain. I won't be camping alone again anytime soon. The forest felt heavier that night than it usually did. I've been camping since I was a kid, and I've always loved the solitude. There's something about the quiet of nature that helps you think clearly. But this time, I wasn't so sure I wanted to be alone. Started the way it always did. I packed light, a small tent, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, some freeze-dried meals, a knife, and a flint for fire. The weather forecast was clear, and I picked a spot deep in the woods, far from the main trails. It's my usual MO. The deeper you go, the less chance you'll encounter other people. That's the appeal. The hike in was uneventful. I parked my car at a small dirt lot off an old logging road, slung my pack over my shoulders, and headed into the woods. The trees stood tall, their branches weaving a thick canopy overhead. The air smelled like pine and damp earth, and the ground beneath my boots felt springy. It was perfect. By mid-afternoon, I'd reached my spot. It was a small clearing, just large enough for my tent, bordered on one side by a steep rock face and on the other by a small stream. The sound of the water trickling over the rocks was soothing. I set up camp quickly, pitching my tent and gathering firewood. By the time I had a small fire going, the sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when I noticed it, a strange silence. It's normal for the woods to quiet down as the sun sets, but this was different. No rustling of leaves, no chirping of crickets, no distant calls of birds, just silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I just wasn't paying attention before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I ate my dinner by the fire, staring into the flames and listening to the occasional crackle of burning wood. The silence pressed in around me, heavy and oppressive. Every now and then, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the darkness. But there was nothing there, just shadows. I decided to turn in early. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night was cold. I crawled into my tent, zipped up the door, and settled into my sleeping bag. The familiar weight of the knife in my pocket was reassuring. I always kept it close when I camped alone. You never know. Sleep didn't come easily. The silence outside was too complete, too unnatural. I lay there, staring at the nylon ceiling of my tent, straining to hear anything. A rustle, a snap, a whisper of wind through the trees. Nothing. Just the sound of my own breathing and the faint thud of my heartbeat in my ears. Then, around midnight, I heard it. A single sharp crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My heart started pounding. I lay perfectly still, holding my breath, listening. Another crack, closer this time, then another. Whatever it was moving toward me. I reached for my flashlight and knife, keeping as quiet as I could. My fingers trembled as I flicked on the light. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the inside of the tent. I waited, my ears straining for the next sound. It came almost immediately, a soft rustling just outside. My mind raced. A bear? Maybe. But bears don't usually come this close to a camp unless there's food left out, and I'd been careful to pack everything away. A coyote? Unlikely. They're skittish around humans. That left one possibility I didn't want to consider. Another person. I unzipped the tent door slowly, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other. The cold night air rushed in, and I shivered. I stepped out, crouching low, and swept the flashlight beam across the clearing. The fire had long since gone out, leaving only a faint glow of ash. The beam caught the edge of the stream, the rock face, the trees. Nothing, but I could feel it, the sensation of being watched. My skin prickled, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I'd felt it before on other trips, but it had always been fleeting, a trick of the mind. This time it was real. I was sure of it. I stayed there for what felt like hours, crouched in the cold, scanning the darkness. The forest was still, almost too still. Eventually, I decided to retreat to the tent. I'd zipped the door halfway up when I heard it again. That same rustling sound, louder now, closer. I whipped the flashlight around, the beam bouncing off the trees. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. Then I saw it, just for a second. A shadow low to the ground, darting between the trees. Too big to be an animal, too fast to be human. My mind couldn't make sense of it. I backed into the tent, zipped it up, and sat there, clutching the knife. The flashlight was off now. I didn't want to give away my position. My breathing was shallow, my ears straining for any sound. But there was nothing. Just that same suffocating silence. I don't know how long I sat there. Long enough for the cold to seep into my bones. Long enough for the adrenaline to wear off and exhaustion to set in. Eventually, I must have dozed off, knife still clutched in my hand. I woke to sunlight filtering through the tent walls. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was gone. Birds chirped in the trees, and the stream gurgled softly. It was as if the night had never happened. I stepped out of the tent, blinking in the bright morning light. The clearing looked the same as it had the day before, but something felt different. I walked to the edge of the trees where I'd seen the shadow. The ground was soft here, damp from the stream, and there it was, a footprint. Not an animal's, but human, barefoot. The toes were splayed, the heel narrow, pressed deep into the mud. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who would be out here barefoot in the middle of the night? And why? My stomach churned as I realized something else. The footprint wasn't leading away from my camp. It was leading toward it. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking. The forest felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. I hiked out as fast as I could, glancing over my shoulder every few minutes, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing. When I reached my car, I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm down. The woods were quiet, peaceful in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something I didn't understand. I never went back to that spot. Hell, I haven't been camping since. The forest might still be out there, waiting, but so am I. And now I'm watching too. It started as a simple camping trip, nothing more than a weekend escape from the routine grind of work and the endless noise of the city. I packed light, a sturdy tent, a sleeping bag, some canned food, and a few essentials. The plan was straightforward. Drive out to a secluded spot deep in the national forest, set up camp, and let the stillness of the woods do its work. I reached the trailhead late in the afternoon. The drive had been uneventful, save for a few wrong turns. By the time I parked, the sun was already dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows over the gravel lot. I grabbed my gear and started hiking. The trail was narrow but well-marked, winding through thick stands of pine and oak. The air smelled of earth and moss, and the only sounds were the rustling leaves and the crunch of my boots on the dirt. The site I had chosen was about 3 miles in, near a small creek. It wasn't an official campground, but it was a spot I'd read about on a hiking forum, a flat patch of ground bordered by trees, with the creek providing both water and a pleasant soundtrack. By the time I arrived, the light was fading fast. I worked quickly, pitching the tent and gathering enough dry wood for a fire. The flames crackled to life just as the last of the daylight slipped away. Dinner was simple. A can of chili heated over the fire, paired with a stiff shot of whiskey from a flask I'd brought along. The stars were out in force, scattered like glitter across the ink-black sky. I sat by the fire for a while, staring into the flames and letting my mind drift. It felt good to be away from everything, to have nothing to do but exist in the moment. By the time I crawled into my tent, the fire had burned down to embers. The creek murmured softly in the background, and I drifted off to sleep almost immediately. But my rest didn't last long. I woke up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding. Something had pulled me from my dreams, but I couldn't say what. I lay still, straining to hear over the pounding of my own pulse. The forest was quiet, too quiet. The usual night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, were conspicuously absent. I reached for my flashlight, my fingers fumbling in the dark. When I finally found it, I clicked it on and shone the beam around the inside of the tent. Nothing seemed out of place, but the uneasy feeling persisted. I unzipped the tent just enough to poke my head out. The fire was nothing more than a faint orange glow, and the trees stood like silent sentinels against the night sky. I swept the flashlight beam across the campsite but saw nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I told myself it was just my imagination, the result of being alone in an unfamiliar place. But as I lay back down, I couldn't ignore the sense of unease. My ears strained for any sound, and my mind conjured images of what might be lurking just beyond the reach of the firelight. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep. When I woke again, it was dawn. The forest was alive with birdsong, and the unease of the night before felt like a distant memory. I brewed a cup of instant coffee over the rekindled fire and tried to shake off the lingering sense of unease. I told myself it was nothing, just the natural fear that comes with being alone in the wilderness. I spent the morning exploring the area. The creek was shallow but clear, and I followed it for a while, letting its gentle flow guide me. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, the sunlight filtering through the leaves and dappling the ground. I found a few animal tracks near the water, deer mostly and what looked like raccoon prints. It was a reminder that I wasn't truly alone out here, even if I hadn't seen any wildlife yet. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was high overhead. I made a simple lunch and spent the afternoon reading a paperback I'd brought along. The hours passed peacefully, the quiet broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant caw of a crow. But as the day wore on and the shadows began to lengthen, the unease from the night before began to creep back in. I told myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks on me. But as I prepared dinner and watched the sun dip lower in the sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees. But there was nothing, just the forest, silent and still. That night, I built the fire bigger and kept it going longer. I stayed up late, staring into the flames and listening to the sounds of the forest. The unease never left me, but nothing happened. Eventually, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I doused the fire and retreated to the tent, telling myself I was being ridiculous. But the night didn't pass peacefully. I woke again in the early hours, the same sense of dread gripping me. This time, I heard it, a faint rustling, like footsteps on dry leaves. My breath caught, and I lay frozen, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't the wind or an animal. It was deliberate. My mind raced. I reached for the flashlight but hesitated. Did I really want to see what was out there? The rustling grew louder, moving around the tent. I'd left my knife within reach, and I grabbed it, my hand shaking. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence was deafening. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching the knife and straining to hear. But the sound didn't come again. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. When I woke, it was morning, and the forest was alive with the sounds of day. But something was different. When I stepped out of the tent, I saw it immediately. Footprints, human footprints circling the campsite. They weren't mine, the treads didn't match my boots. My stomach turned, and a cold sweat broke out on my skin. Someone had been here, walking around my tent while I slept. I packed up camp in record time, my hands trembling as I stuffed gear into my pack. I didn't bother with breakfast or even putting out the fire properly. I just wanted to get out of there. The hike back to the car was a blur. Every sound, every shadow made my heart race. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the car, I threw my pack in the back and locked the doors the moment I was inside. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. The sense of relief as I pulled out of the lot was overwhelming, but it didn't erase the fear. Someone had been out there watching me, and I'd never know who they were or what they wanted. Even now, back in the safety of my apartment, I can't shake the memory. The woods were supposed to be a place of peace, a retreat from the chaos of everyday life, but they'd shown me something else. A side of the world that was quiet, yes, but also deeply, unsettlingly unknowable. I've always liked being alone in nature. Something about the quiet, the way the air smells of pine, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the sense of isolation. It's like therapy to me. So when I decided to take a solo camping trip to the northern woods, I was looking forward to nothing but peace. I packed my gear, checked the weather forecast, and drove out early on a Friday morning, aiming to reach the trailhead by midday. The drive was uneventful, the kind of monotonous highway miles that leave you lost in your own head. By the time I pulled off onto the gravel road leading to the trailhead, the forest was already stretching its long arms around me. The further I drove, the narrower the road became, with the trees crowding in until it felt like I was tunneling into another world. The trailhead parking lot was empty, exactly what I wanted. I shouldered my pack, checked my map, and headed out. My plan was to hike about 6 miles to a small lake where I'd set up camp for the night. From what I'd read, the area was remote and rarely visited. Perfect. The trail was well marked at first, winding through tall pines and over soft, mossy ground. The only sounds were my boots crunching on the dirt and the occasional bird call. It was perfect. About 2 miles in, the trail began to get rougher. Roots snaked across the path, and there were a few downed trees to climb over. I didn't mind. This was exactly what I was looking for. Solitude and a little bit of challenge. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the water. It was as beautiful as I'd hoped. A small, clear lake surrounded by dense forest. I found a spot on the southern shore where the ground was flat and clear enough to pitch my tent. I set up camp quickly, eager to enjoy the last bit of daylight. After getting my tent and fire pit ready, I sat by the lake and watched the sunset. The water turned a deep orange, then purple, then black as the light faded. I made myself a simple dinner of instant noodles and jerky over the fire, and by the time I was finished eating, the stars were out. It was the kind of sky you only see far from civilization, thick with stars and streaked with the faint glow of the Milky Way. I stayed up for a while, just sitting by the fire, listening to the forest. The occasional rustle in the underbrush reminded me I wasn't truly alone. Probably a raccoon or a deer. Still, it added a slight edge to the tranquility, enough to keep me alert. When the fire burned low, I crawled into my tent and zipped myself into my sleeping bag. The ground was hard and a little uneven, but I was tired, and sleep came quickly. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The forest was silent, eerily so. No wind, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just silence. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy, pressing in on you. I lay still, listening, trying to pick up on anything unusual. Then I heard it. A faint sound, almost like a whisper, but too irregular to be a voice. It was coming from outside the tent, near the lake. My first thought was that it could be an animal, a fox, or maybe a raccoon, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too human. I stayed still, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was nothing, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't a whisper after all. It was the sound of footsteps. Someone was walking along the shore of the lake. I reached for my flashlight, moving as quietly as I could. My hand was shaking as I clicked it on, but I didn't unzip the tent. Instead, I pointed the beam toward the wall of the tent, hoping to catch a shadow or some movement. Nothing. The footsteps had stopped. For what felt like an eternity, I sat there, gripping the flashlight, my ears straining for any sound. The silence had returned, but it felt different now. Menacing. I considered unzipping the tent and shining the light outside, but the thought of seeing someone or something standing there froze me in place. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was nothing. Maybe an animal, or the sound of the water lapping against the shore. I lay back down, though I didn't bother getting back into the sleeping bag. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, the forest felt normal again. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and the lake looked as peaceful as ever. I told myself I'd overreacted. Still, as I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off. I decided to cut my trip short. There was another trail that looped back to the parking lot, about 8 miles. A longer hike, but it would get me out of the woods before nightfall. The hike started out fine. The trail was rougher than the one I'd taken in, but manageable. I kept a steady pace, my eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The unease from the night before was still with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. About 4 miles in, I came across something that stopped me in my tracks. A shoe, just one, lying in the middle of the trail. It was old and dirty, the kind of thing you'd expect to see discarded on the side of a highway, not out here in the middle of nowhere. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. It was a hiking boot, well worn but still intact. No obvious signs of how it had gotten there. I looked around, but there was no other sign of anyone. No footprints, no discarded gear, nothing. I set the boot down and kept moving, though my pace was slower now. Every sound, every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. As the day wore on, the trail became harder to follow. The markers were faded, and in some places it was overgrown. I checked my map and GPS frequently, making sure I was still on track. By mid-afternoon, I was starting to worry I wouldn't make it back to the car before dark. Then I found the campsite. It wasn't marked on the map, and it didn't look like an official site. Just a clearing with a fire ring made of stones and a few logs arranged as benches. But what struck me was how recently it had been used. The ashes in the fire ring were still warm. There were empty food wrappers scattered around, and a tarp hung between 2 trees, forming a makeshift shelter. It didn't feel right. Something about the site seemed rushed, like whoever had been there had left in a hurry. I didn't linger. The sun was already dipping lower, and I wanted to put as much distance as I could between myself and that campsite. The last couple of miles were the hardest. The trail was almost non-existent, and I was constantly checking my GPS to make sure I wasn't getting lost. By the time I finally saw the trailhead parking lot through the trees, the sun was setting. My car was the only one there. I threw my pack in the trunk and climbed into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the trailhead. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a figure standing just at the edge of the trees. But when I blinked, it was gone. The drive home was a blur. I didn't relax until I was back in my apartment, the door locked behind me. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd been followed. I double-checked the locks on my windows and doors before finally collapsing into bed. It's been a few weeks now, and I haven't been back to the woods. I keep telling myself it was nothing, that I let my imagination get the better of me. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the footsteps by the lake, the abandoned boot, the campsite, and I wonder if somewhere out there, someone is thinking about me too. I woke up to the sound of rustling leaves, a soft but persistent noise that set me on edge. The campsite was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the dying fire. My tent felt small and fragile, a thin layer of fabric separating me from the vast, indifferent wilderness. I tried to dismiss the unease that had settled in my chest, convincing myself it was nothing more than the unfamiliarity of being out here alone. This trip had been my idea. I needed a break from the monotony of daily life, from the hum of the city and the suffocating routine. I'd planned every detail. 3 days in the mountains, no distractions, no people. Just me, my thoughts, and nature. It sounded idyllic when I envisioned it, but now, lying in my sleeping bag, I felt exposed and vulnerable. The rustling grew louder. It wasn't just the wind brushing through the trees. It was deliberate, rhythmic. My heartbeat quickened. I reached for my flashlight, fumbling slightly in the dark. When I finally clicked it on, the beam of light pierced through the fabric of the tent, illuminating nothing but the surrounding trees. I couldn't see what was making the noise, but I was certain now that something was out there. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other harmless animal. This was their home, after all. I had read about how animals can be curious about campsites, drawn in by the scent of food. My food was packed in a bare canister, locked away from reach, but maybe the lingering smell of dinner had lured something closer. The noise stopped as suddenly as it had started. I held my breath, listening for any hint of movement. The silence was deafening. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that whatever it was had moved on. I lay back down, my grip on the flashlight tightening. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent into the crisp mountain air. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The unease of the night before lingered, but I tried to shake it off. This was why I had come out here, to disconnect, to challenge myself, to experience something raw and real. I brewed a cup of coffee over my small camping stove and sat by the fire pit, letting the warmth seep into my hands. It wasn't until I started packing up my gear for a hike that I noticed the tracks. They were faint but unmistakable, imprints in the soft earth just a few feet from my tent. I crouched down to get a better look. They weren't animal tracks. They were boot prints. Someone had been here. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. This area wasn't popular with hikers, and I hadn't seen another soul since I arrived. The logical part of me argued that it could have been an old trail, that the prints weren't fresh. But deep down, I knew they were new. The edges were sharp, not softened by time or weather. I decided not to dwell on it. There was no use in scaring myself over something that might have a simple explanation. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I hiked through the forest, every snap of a twig and rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me, but the trail behind me was always empty. By the time I returned to the campsite, the sun was sinking low in the sky. I built a fire and cooked a quick meal, trying to focus on the rhythmic tasks rather than the growing knot in my stomach. The forest was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy and unnatural. As darkness fell, I decided to double-check everything. I secured my food, triple-checked the tent zippers, and even positioned my flashlight and knife within arm's reach. Paranoia, I told myself, but as I settled into my sleeping bag, I couldn't shake the sense that something wasn't right. The sound came again, louder this time. Footsteps. Not the erratic scuffling of an animal, but deliberate, measured steps. My breath caught in my throat. I reached for the flashlight, my hand trembling as I clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice breaking. The footsteps stopped. Silence. My own heartbeat was deafening in my ears. I stayed awake the entire night, clutching the flashlight and knife like lifelines. Every sound made me jump. The footsteps didn't return, but the damage was done. I was on edge, my nerves frayed to the point of breaking. When dawn finally arrived, I made a decision. I wasn't staying another night. I'd come out here for peace and solitude, but all I'd found was fear and uncertainty. As I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest felt oppressive, its dense canopy closing in around me. The hike back to my car was grueling. I'd chosen this spot because of its remoteness, but now the isolation felt like a curse. Every step I took felt heavier, weighed down by the sense of unease that had followed me since that first night. I kept glancing over my shoulder, convinced I'd see someone or something following me, but the trail remained empty. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief so intense it nearly brought me to tears. My car was exactly where I'd left it, untouched. I threw my gear into the back seat and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine, I couldn't help but look back at the trailhead one last time. That's when I saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, partially hidden by the shadows. They didn't move, didn't wave, didn't call out. They just stood there watching. I didn't wait to find out who they were or what they wanted. I slammed the car into gear and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until I was miles away from the forest. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me, like a lingering shadow that refused to fade. I never went camping alone again. I never considered myself much of a camper, but every now and then, life pushes you into situations you wouldn't normally choose. This was one of those times. I needed a break from everything: work, city noise, and the constant buzz of notifications. My friend Mark had suggested this spot deep in the woods about 3 hours' drive from the nearest town. He swore by it, said it was the perfect escape. I borrowed a tent, packed enough food and supplies for 2 days, and set out early on a Friday morning. The drive was uneventful, long stretches of highway giving way to narrower roads flanked by towering trees. By noon, I reached the dirt path Mark had mentioned, the one that would take me to the clearing where I could set up camp. It was bumpy and overgrown, the kind of road that makes you question whether your car's suspension will survive. But eventually, I made it. The clearing was beautiful, a small patch of open land surrounded by dense forest. The air was cool, and the only sounds were birds and the rustle of leaves. I set up my tent near the edge of the clearing, close enough to a cluster of trees for some shade, but far enough that I wasn't completely swallowed by the forest. I unpacked, laid out my sleeping bag, and gathered some firewood for the evening. The first few hours passed peacefully. I read a book, snacked on some trail mix, and let my mind wander. Felt good to disconnect. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I started a fire. The warmth and light were comforting as the temperature dropped. I cooked a simple dinner, just some sausages and beans, and sat there, staring into the flames, feeling more relaxed than I had in weeks. When the stars came out, it was like someone had thrown a glittering blanket over the sky. There was no light pollution here, nothing to dim their brilliance. But the tranquility started to shift as the night deepened. It wasn't anything dramatic at first, just little things. The forest seemed louder in the dark. Crickets, distant hoots of owls, the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. I told myself it was normal, that nature's soundtrack was just different from the urban hum I was used to. Still, I couldn't shake a growing unease. I decided to call it a night. The fire had burned down to embers, and the chill was starting to seep into my bones. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up tight, and settled into my sleeping bag. Sleep came slowly. Every little noise outside seemed amplified in the silence. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. I kept telling myself it was just animals, a raccoon, maybe a deer. Nothing to worry about. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up abruptly. I wasn't sure what had roused me at first. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. The forest was quieter now, the kind of quiet that feels deliberate, like everything is holding its breath. Then I heard it, a faint but distinct sound. Footsteps. Not the random rustling of an animal, but steady, deliberate steps. I froze, every muscle in my body tense. The footsteps were slow, measured, and they were getting closer. My mind raced. Who would be out here, miles away from the nearest road, in the middle of the night? My first thought was that it might be another camper, someone who had stumbled upon my sight. But there was something off about the sound. It wasn't hesitant, like someone unsure of their surroundings. It was confident. I reached for my flashlight, careful not to make a sound, and clicked it on. The beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the inside of my tent. I hesitated for a moment before unzipping the flap just enough to peek outside. The clearing was empty, the fire reduced to glowing coals. I swept the flashlight beam across the trees, but saw nothing. The footsteps had stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring into the dark, waiting for something to happen. But the forest remained silent. Eventually, exhaustion overtook fear, and I drifted back to sleep, the flashlight still clutched in my hand. The next morning, I woke to the sound of birdsong and sunlight filtering through the fabric of the tent. For a moment, the fear of the night before felt like a bad dream. But when I stepped outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. Around the edges of the clearing, the grass was trampled in places, as if someone had walked there. Not an animal, the tracks were too large, too deliberate. I tried to brush it off, told myself it could have been anything. Maybe I'd made the tracks myself when I was setting up camp and just hadn't noticed. Still, a part of me was on edge. I decided to spend the day exploring, hoping to shake the unease. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and ventured into the woods, following a narrow trail that wound its way through the trees. The forest was beautiful during the day, sunlight streaming through the canopy, casting dappled patterns on the ground. I found a small stream, its water clear and cold, and followed it for a while. The sound of running water was soothing, a reminder of how far I was from the chaos of the city. By the time I made my way back to camp, it was late afternoon. The unease from the morning had faded, replaced by a sense of accomplishment. I'd spent the day outdoors, disconnected, just like I'd hoped. As evening fell, I restarted the fire and cooked another simple meal. The night seemed less threatening now. I convinced myself that whatever I'd heard, or thought I'd heard, was just my imagination. I stayed up a little later, enjoying the firelight and the stars, before crawling into the tent for my second night. I woke up again, sometime after midnight. This time, it wasn't footsteps that woke me, but a different sound, a faint scratching, like something brushing against the fabric of the tent. I held my breath, straining to hear. The scratching stopped, then started again, closer to where my head was. I didn't move, didn't even blink, my mind racing with possibilities. An animal? The wind? But there was no breeze. Gathering my courage, I whispered, "Hello?" immediately regretting it. The scratching stopped. Silence. I waited, my heart hammering, but there was no response. Slowly, I reached for the flashlight again. This time, I unzipped the tent quickly and shone the beam outside. The clearing was empty, just like the night before, but the unease was back, stronger now. I didn't sleep much after that, jumping at every sound, every shift of the wind. The next morning, I made a decision. I was cutting the trip short. The peace I'd sought wasn't worth the growing sense of dread. As I packed up, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something standing at the edge of the clearing. But there was nothing. The drive back felt longer than the drive there. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the main road, a wave of relief washed over me. I'd made it out. Whatever had happened or hadn't happened was behind me. It wasn't until I was home, unpacking my gear, that I found the note. It was folded neatly and tucked into one of the outer pockets of my backpack. The handwriting was small and precise. The words simple but chilling. "Next time, stay longer." I don't think I'll ever forget the way the forest smelled that night. The damp earth, pine sap, and the faint trace of smoke curling from my campfire. It was supposed to be a solo trip, just me, my gear, and the quiet peace of nature. I'd picked a remote spot about 10 miles from the nearest trailhead. It was off the beaten path, tucked away from the usual campsites where families and noisy groups would gather. I wanted solitude, a break from the chaos of city life. The hike to the spot was uneventful. The trail wound through dense forest, the kind where sunlight barely breaks through the canopy. I'd planned carefully, plenty of water, food, and a sturdy tent. My backpack was heavy, but I felt strong. The air was crisp, and the quiet was a welcome change from the constant hum of traffic back home. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a creek. The water's gentle babble was the only sound, and I knew this was the perfect place to set up camp. The clearing was surrounded by towering pines, their needles forming a thick carpet on the ground. I pitched my tent near the edge of the trees, close enough to the creek for easy access to water but far enough to avoid the damp chill. As evening settled in, I built a small fire. The flames danced and crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees. I cooked a simple meal, just some noodles and instant coffee, and sat by the fire, enjoying the solitude. The sky darkened to a deep indigo, and the stars began to emerge, brighter and more numerous than I'd ever seen in the city. It was around 10 p.m. when I decided to turn in. The fire had burned down to embers, and the temperature was dropping fast. I crawled into my tent, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and listened to the sounds of the forest. The creek's gentle gurgle, the occasional rustle of leaves, nothing out of the ordinary. I've camped enough to know these sounds well, and they usually lull me to sleep. But that night, sleep didn't come easily. Maybe it was the unfamiliarity of the place or the fact that I was entirely alone. I lay there for what felt like hours, staring at the ceiling of the tent and trying to quiet my racing thoughts. Eventually, I drifted off. I woke up abruptly. It was pitch black inside the tent, and for a moment, I couldn't figure out what had woken me. My heart was pounding, my senses heightened. I lay still, straining to hear anything beyond the blood rushing in my ears. First, there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest at night. But then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. My mind raced. Could have been an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon. But the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. Someone was walking. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The footsteps grew louder, closer. They were coming from the direction of the creek. My tent was well hidden among the trees, but whoever was out there didn't seem to be wandering aimlessly. They were heading straight for my campsite. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling. My knife was in my backpack, just out of reach. I cursed myself for not keeping it closer. The footsteps stopped just outside my tent. I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears, drowning out everything else. Whoever it was, they were standing right there. I turned on the flashlight and aimed it at the tent wall. The beam of light revealed the silhouette of a figure, tall and motionless. They didn't speak, didn't move. They just stood there. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. My throat was dry, and I could barely think. "Who's there?" I finally managed to call out, my voice shaky and hoarse. There was no response. The figure didn't move. I was frozen, every muscle in my body tense. After what felt like an eternity, the silhouette shifted slightly, then turned and walked away, the footsteps fading into the forest. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat in the tent with my flashlight and knife, every sound outside amplified in the stillness. When dawn finally broke, I emerged cautiously, scanning the clearing for any sign of the intruder. There were footprints in the soft ground near the creek, leading to and from my tent. They were large, clearly human. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even in the daylight. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could. The serene beauty of the forest was gone, replaced by an oppressive sense of unease. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that silhouette again. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur. I'd never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. It wasn't until I reached my car that I finally felt a semblance of safety. I locked the doors, started the engine, and didn't look back. Even now, months later, I can't explain what happened. There were no reports of anyone else in the area, no signs of foul play, but something about that night haunts me. The figure's silence, the way they stood so still, so close, felt deliberate, calculated. I've always loved the solitude of the wilderness, but now, I'm not so sure. Sometimes the quiet isn't peaceful. Sometimes it's the sound of something or someone waiting